Hello there. This is looking at the 8th chapter of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Again, I am using the Signet Classics version, so if you're following along with the page references, otherwise the text will be the same, but obviously the pages will not be. So in chapter 8, the last night, we have Utterson goes to Jekyll's house. There are strange voices there. Paul has heard something 8 days ago. The servants are all up in arms. Paul and Utterson break in to the laboratory, the cabinet that Jekyll has last been in and where the voices have been coming from. A voice cries out, asking for mercy, and as they get in, Hyde is on the floor, bleeding, wearing Jekyll's suit, and sort of twitching around, obviously having taken poison because there's this crushed vial of poison in his hand. Utterson sees that he has 3 letters, and he goes home in order to read Lanyon's. So when we're looking at this chapter, something that's really interesting is that it's kind of the climax of the novel. And if it were a detective novel, this moment of climax is where you would expect there to be a denouement, some sort of resolution and enlightenment to what's happening. But this is then placed very firmly away from detective novel and into the idea of being gothic, because it is supernatural and a huge mystery still, even though this is the climax of the action. And it's interesting that we see Utterson almost sort of absurdly clinging to the rational when he's talking to the servants, even though the servants seem to detect and fear something that is beyond the realms of what would be happening in normal life. And it isn't just that Utterson wants to cling to the decorum that would be expected of a gentleman. He obviously has a fear of the supernatural or something beyond the realms of rationality. And I think what's very interesting is, just like so much of the action in this novel, this is happening at night. So we again reinforces those gothic ideas of things being mysterious and dark. And we also see London as being the sort of terrible, nightmarish venue for everything that happens. So it's literally dark because it is night, but also it's metaphorically dark in the way that Stevenson's pointing out that this enormous, gargantuan city has grown up into something that is frightful and provokes fear in people because it seems to be so sort of out of control. So again, we're seeing London almost as the extra character in Jekyll and Hyde. So if we start on page 87, the first words I have highlighted is Utterson's imperative to Paul, where he says, be explicit. And there's an irony in that, because Utterson literally never has been explicit up until this point. Even though he's filled with fear and doubts, he will not articulate them. And he asks, what are you afraid of? But we need to think, actually, what is Utterson afraid of when he is not articulating and being explicit? He seems to be afraid both of reputation damage and disapproval of society, and as well as that, being afraid of confronting the supernatural or the gothic elements. If we carry on down to the bottom of page 87, we get this quotation where Paul is described as his manners was altered for the worst, and that gives us echoes of Lanyon. So anyone who is involved in this mystery seems to physically deteriorate, and it shows, their fear shows on their face and in their appearance. Turning over to page 88, if we look down to the first highlight, it was a wild, cold and a seasonable night of March. We very much get the sense of the pathetic fallacy here. Coldness, wildness, things feeling threatening and out of control. And I think it's interesting that the pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her gives a sense of disruption in the atmosphere, that things that are unnatural are happening, not just within the elements, but also within the narrative of the story. If we keep going down to the bottom of the page, we again get pathetic fallacy. The thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing, almost as though they're punishing themselves, perhaps making us think about Jekyll being locked up in his lab and in his cabinet, him sort of pushing himself to the absolute limits of endurance. If we turn over now to page 89, I have looked down to where Mr. Utterson is sort of scolding the servants in Jekyll's home for not doing what they're supposed to do, that they're all huddled together. It says servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep, and there's hysterical whimpering. And he says, very irregular, very unseemly, your master would be far from pleased. So again, even at this huge moment of crisis and fear, Utterson is clinging to the propriety of what should be happening. This is not the proper way to behave. A servant should know their job and be doing their job. It reinforces that idea that for Utterson, for Stevenson, shown through Utterson, there's this damaging clinging to propriety above all else. If we turn over to page 90, I've moved down again quite a long way, where they have heard the voice from the cabinet, Paul and Utterson, and Utterson mentions it seems much changed. So there is someone in there, but it's not exactly Jekyll's voice, heightening the sense of mystery that Stevenson is creating. And here at the bottom, Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry out upon the name of God, and who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there is a thing that cries to heaven. And it's quite interesting that Stevenson is putting these religious words in Paul's mouth, in that it's the name of God and cries to heaven, showing that people are clinging to a sense of morality and religion when there is a moment of great crisis. Obviously, there was, if we think about context in AO3, slight religious doubt with the introduction of the idea of things like evolution and Darwin, the origin of the species, but yet still at moments of crisis, Stevenson has this very traditional butler crying out to a Christian God. Moving over now to page 91, we've got Utterson's first line that's highlighted in this. It doesn't commend itself to reason. So again, Utterson cannot move beyond the rational. He's clinging to the sense as things can't be explained, and he is just trying to find a reasonable explanation, even though the whole situation around him is unravelling. I've also highlighted the word pure about 2/3 of the way down the page, because I think it's a really interesting use of the word. It's obviously being used here in the context of medicine and chemicals, but also that Jekyll at this stage wanted this purity, almost that he's been besmirched by his association with Hyde, and he's trying to find a sort of purity, a way out of the evil that he is engaged with. If we move over now on to page 92, we look just under halfway, so just over halfway down, that it was but for one moment that I saw him, but the hair stood up upon my head like quills. So we have again got someone else describing an association with Hyde, and this unnamed fear and repulsion that again, language, Stevenson is showing us, is inadequate in the face of something quite so revolting. I think it's interesting that it's the use of the simile that he cry out like a rat, with rats have their association with being vermin, spreading disease, and whether Jekyll is sort of spreading this moral dirt and moral insanity through society by doing what he has done. Again, if we go down, that God grant that he be not deceived. I think that's very interesting. There's a sort of irony in that when Utterson is saying that as a man who seems to be clinging to self-belief in order to not have to confront things that he finds uncomfortable. If we turn over now to page 93, that thing was not my master. So when he's being Hyde, he's seen as so repulsive. He's not even a man or a human. They've used the word thing here if we're looking for some interesting AO2. And again, we've got this idea of Hyde being like a dwarf, and we've discussed before this idea of his sort of smallness, his kind of evolution going backwards, that he seems primitive and unformed in some way, and tying into a Victorian fear of what would happen if people were not remaining sort of civilized and behaving with the societal expectations that allowed Britain to run at that time. This idea of things being backwards and therefore being fearful, and people being fearful of it and then being frightful. We've got the irony, but it was never Dr. Jekyll, and this idea that Paul is stating at that moment it is not Jekyll, but obviously it has previously been, and it is so far removed from what Jekyll was that it's almost unbelievable it could be the same man. I think it's interesting when we go down to the bottom of page 93 when Utterson says, we should be frank. We both think more than we have said, and continues over onto the page of top of page 94. We should make a clean breast, because Utterson, as we've discussed, is shown by Stevenson as someone who will not be frank and open and articulate what he actually fears. It's really interesting that he's now trying to get Paul to do that when he will go no further than just asking him to be frank and then making a statement. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognise it? And asking Paul. So he puts the onus on Paul to be open rather than articulating his own fears. And if we're thinking about it because of AO3, again with context, the social order would be that you would expect a lawyer to be taking the lead in this rather than a butler who would be seeing Utterson as his social superior. The highlight down the side on page 94, then you must know as well as the rest of us there was something queer about that gentleman. Again, we've got the description of Hyde where we cannot really grasp what it is about him that makes him seem so unsettling and so repulsive to other people. Some nice use of quotations there that you can perhaps utilise for AO2. If we go down a bit further, I've highlighted the word evil. So Utterson here is showing a sort of almost biblical sense of what is feared. It's not just something that has gone wrong, it's not just something distasteful, it is actually evil. And he mentions God alone can tell. So I think it's really interesting that we link that back to ideas about faith, doubt, and morality in the 19th century. As we turn over to page 95, we've got some more pathetic fallacy, because it's now quite dark. The Gothic sense heightening the suspense and fear for both the characters and the reader. And Stevenson's use at the bottom of the page, weeping like a woman or a lost soul, by Paul. Again, this link to religion and morality, that what is there to be trusted in a moment like this, if not the sort of tradition of religion and what that brings with it. If we turn over to page 96, I think it's interesting that we note Stevenson's use of zoomorphism, a dismal screech as of mere animal terror rang from the cabinet. And we are seeing this idea again that evolution sort of going backwards, things becoming less civilized, and that being huge fear in the 19th century, and the animalistic tendencies of Hyde making him seem more repugnant, more repulsive. I think what's quite interesting, if we go to the bottom of page 96 with the body of a man sorely contorted and still twitching, so move on to page 97, we're getting the truth of him, of his death here, that he is dying, that he's been poisoned, and more of the mystery that he's dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. And although it's a semblance of life in his face, I think it's really interesting that Stevenson uses that phrase here to describe his face when normal human life is not generally being detected in Hyde. There is something beyond normal human expressions on his face. Yet here, when he's lying dying, it is again just a semblance of life. It uses the term the body of a self-destroyer to emphasize suicide, but almost the free indirect speech of he knew that he was looking at the body of a self-destroyer shows structurally Utterson. We hear his thoughts, and he does not want to articulate the idea of suicide with all its attendant shame and guilt that would be associated with it in the 19th century. Carrying on down to the bottom of page 97, we have nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Mystery again, and that idea that I was talking about at the start of this chapter, that although we've reached the climax of the action, we are no closer to having the mystery solved for us. Turning over to page 98, I've highlighted that Utterson was amazed to find a copy of a pious work for which Jekyll had several times expressed great esteem, annotated in his own hand with startling blasphemies. And we can link that again to the ideas at the end of the 19th century and Victorian times with the rejection of wholesale belief in Christianity and biblical ideas, with Jekyll having blasphemed by stating against this. Turning over to page 99, I have highlighted the three different pieces of paper that are significant. So number one, first there was a will. Interestingly, this has now been drawn up in to benefit Utterson rather than benefit Hyde. Number two, it was a brief note in the doctor's hand and dated at the top. Interestingly, Utterson here cannot look beyond the rational. So because it's dated for that day, Utterson believes that Jekyll was here this day, he's alive. Again, as I said, refusing to see any of the supernatural elements. And if we're thinking about reputational damage at the bottom of the page, oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe. So this idea that damage to Jekyll's reputation is something that should absolutely be feared and that the two men will try to avoid if they possibly can. If we turn over to page 100, we have the third piece of paper, a considerable packet sealed in several places. And this obviously becomes significant as Utterson goes home. I've highlighted we may at least save his credit, linking back to that main theme of reputation and appearance, that he would rather, if he can, save Jekyll's respectability than have too much of the truth uncovered. And we need to think about what Stevenson is saying about this Victorian obsession with reputation and propriety rather than it being about justice or enlightenment or knowledge. We've also got the motif again throughout the whole chapter of Utterson being a rational detective. He refuses to see beyond the rational and start accepting that there is something corrupt and supernatural about what has been happening. So this is one of the longer chapters in the novel, and there are a few really interesting AO2 points, a few interesting AO3 points. It does push the narrative forward. There's more action here than probably the rest of the novel that's preceded it, and yet interestingly, the reader is left by Stevenson no more enlightened than he and Utterson were at the start of the chapter. Thank you.